All of the Dark Souls games so far have come with an opening FMV cinematic trailer. These tend to have a huge impact on the way we perceive the rest of the game, as the Souls games are told with relatively little story other than what is given in these cutscenes. To work out if this trailer is good news or not for the Dark Souls fans, I'm also going to look at the openings of Dark Souls 1 and 2 and discuss the impacts that they had on their respective games. So starting with the trailer for Dark Souls 3. It starts out with some undead travellers on some pilgrimage. We see them find, as far as I can work out, that in this particular cycle of the world, a chosen undead has failed to link the fire, and the world is now ending. A bell is also rung, and we have the old Lords of Cinder rising. From this, I think we can assume that these guys are in some way going to try and link the fire, and we as the player in some way have to stop them and let the world end, or collect enough souls or embers to try and relight the fire ourselves. I like this because it's taking the series in a new direction on the surface by giving these guardians a slightly different purpose, other than being the crazed gods that we're used to, but generally the core of the game isn't going to change. The core being that you fight loads of interesting bosses to determine the fate of a dying world. It works perfectly well when approached properly, so I have nothing to complain about here. The opening itself is much more similar to Dark Souls 1, where we're seemingly introduced to all the main bosses and given a fair bit of detail of the world, as it is at the time that the game takes place. I would say that when compared to Souls 1, the opening of Souls 3 feels a little bit too much like a roll call. These guardians are probably the main bosses, but we're not really given any context about them. All we know is that they've laid still for a certain amount of time, and now that they're rising, they're going to link the flames. They're given quite a shallow story so far in the context of the trailer. Souls 1 gave us more history on the lords themselves. During it we learnt that they had different roles and different lives in the Souls universe. None of this is really explored in the Souls 3 trailer, so it ends up lacking a little bit in personality. I prefer the opening of Souls 3 to Souls 2, however. You've probably already heard people complaining about Souls 2, so I'm going to keep this brief and say that Dark Souls 2 is better than most games I've played, and has an exceptional number of good ideas executed very well. The criticisms for Dark Souls 2 are also made worse because it's being compared to Dark Souls 1, which is generally considered to have near-perfect storytelling, which is where a lot of Dark Souls 2 fell short. The opening of Dark Souls 2 focuses on the player character, who is told to go off and fight bosses in a strange place, and then they will stop being undead. The Dark Souls games stand out because of the world around the player. The story is generally up to the player to interpret by piecing together stories that they can read about if they choose. Using the intro to completely focus on the player themselves shows a bit of a misdirection on what the player should be focusing on. In Souls 1 we were given no goal. The opening left us aimlessly exploring and trying to ring some bells for some reason. The player and their character were both connected with the simple goal of exploring just to see what would happen. You had no agenda, which allowed you to be drawn into the world even more. As players, we don't really need an agenda, especially considering that the world around us is telling us the story so effectively. The opening of Dark Souls 3 appears to be hitting the middle ground between these games. Like Souls 1, the state of the world has been focused on much more, and we've been given a character with no real identity to bond with. But like Dark Souls 2, the exact history of the world and those in it is a mystery. Because of this, the guardians that you're introduced to don't really have any intrigue or anything in the context of the trailer itself. I think if you're going to show the main bosses, you should make them interesting by giving them some story. If you're not going to show them, you should hide them until the very end and build up story throughout the game and then reveal them suddenly. The trailer doesn't really do either of these things. We see the bosses, but we don't get to learn anything about them. So overall, the trailer doesn't really give us as much story as Dark Souls 1, but it also doesn't force a story upon us, which I think was a real concern for most Dark Souls players, especially considering what happened in Dark Souls 2. So what this trailer says is that we can probably put our minds to rest, and hopefully when the game comes out we can just enjoy the story and the world as it is presented to us without a direct goal that we have to be focusing on. If this was the first game in the series, I would say this opening has no real problems, since it gives us the current situation in the world and it also gives us the player character with no defined purpose. The biggest problem is that because this is a sequel, our goal from the trailer appears to be fairly obvious. It's most likely that we're going to kill bosses to relight or not relight the flame. The only way around this though is to create an entirely new story for the Souls games, which I don't think is entirely necessary, because this basic story is the framework really, and then the rest of the game is built around it, and it's the quality of that padding that we've seen is what makes the game great. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed my videos you can subscribe here, and to help me continue making them you can donate here. Thanks very much.